Valkyrie 1. I repeat, the primary target has aggressed the area of operations. You are directed to return to base, effective immediately. The voice over the radio was fractured by static, but the order was crystal clear. Captain Katarina Rostova could feel every vibration of the A-10 Warthog through her flight gloves. Below her left wing, the desert floor lit up with small sparks, unfriendly muzzle flashes. The smell of ozone and sweat filled the cramped cockpit. Spectre actual status report? She said, her voice dangerously calm, ignoring the order from command. We are pinned down coordinates 09er Delta, need support. Now a burst of rifle fire overwhelmed his words. Then the line went dead. Valkyrie 1, this is a final order. Disengage. You are not authorized to engage targets of opportunity. Acknowledge. Katarina glanced down at her thermal display. 12 friendly heat signatures were being swarmed by more than 50 hostile ones. They would not last 5 more minutes. She took a deep, sharp breath. Her choice had been made long ago, not in this moment, but from a painful memory years ago. Command Valkyrie 1 acknowledges the order. She replied, her voice even. Just put it in the report. I am engaging on my own authority. She cut the command channel, her hand pushing the control stick forward with finality. The Warthog's nose dipped, and the enemy-infested ground rushed up to meet her. The sun bled across the horizon of the Arabian desert, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and molten orange. At Al Dhafra Air Base, the heat was already a physical presence, a suffocating blanket that shimmered above the concrete tarmac. It smelled of scorched sand jet fuel and the faint metallic tang of ozone. For Captain Katarina Rostova, this was the smell of another day at the office. She stood beside her aircraft. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, a machine as famously stubborn and unglamorous as its reputation suggested. Its pilots called it the Warthog. Others, usually the sleek F-16 drivers who strutted past with an air of effortless superiority, called it a flying relic. Katarina simply called it hers. Her flight suit was zipped to the collar, her helmet cradled in the crook of her arm. With methodical precision, she conducted her pre-flight walk around her gloved fingers, tracing the seams and rivets of the fuselage. Her movements were economical, deliberate, betraying none of the internal restlessness that was her constant companion. She ran a hand along the immense barrel of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon that defined the aircraft's nose. 7 barrels of 30mm retribution. It was a brutal, honest weapon for a brutal, honest job. Everything is ready for you, Captain, a voice called out. Staff Sergeant Miller. Her crew chief wiped a greasy hand on a rag, his face a mask of professional respect. He was one of the few who did not seem to mistake her quiet intensity for arrogance. He understood the language of the machine, and by extension, he seemed to understand her. Thank you, Sergeant Katarina, replied, her voice even. Any issues with the hydraulics overnight? None, ma'am. She is as solid as they come. She gave him a slight nod, a gesture that for her was the equivalent of a warm smile. The younger pilots might have their afterburners and their fly-by-wire sophistication, but they did not have a relationship with their aircraft. Katarina did. She knew its groans, its vibrations, the specific way the port engine whined on a cold start. This machine was an extension of her will, a grim but faithful servant. As she prepared to climb the ladder into the cockpit, a pair of F-16 pilots walked by their conversation, loud enough to be intentional. Look at that. Taking the old pig out for a stroll, one of them said, a smirk playing on his lips. Must be some very threatening sand dunes that need to be disciplined today. Katarina did not turn. She did not acknowledge them. She had learned long ago that to engage was to lose. Her reputation preceded her Ice Queen. Valkyrie. a pilot clinically precise but devoid of the requisite swagger. They saw a woman who was cold and distant. They did not see the ghost that flew with her in the cockpit, the memory of a past mission where following the rules had cost good men their lives. That memory was the furnace that forged her discipline and the source of her silent, unyielding vow never again. She settled into the surprisingly cramped cockpit, the titanium bathtub that surrounded her feeling less like armor and more like a sarcophagus. She began her systems check flipping switches with practiced familiarity. The heads-up display flickered to life, casting a faint green glow on her face. Tomorrow's mission was a standard surveillance patrol over Sector Gamma 9, a long, uneventful flight over endless, empty desert. Boring. Safe. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, the cacophony of the flight line fading away. Another day. Another flight. She pushed the memory down, locking it away in the steel box where she kept all the things that could break her. The mission was the only thing that mattered. Hundreds of miles away from the relative safety of Al-Dhafra, in a sterile, windowless briefing room, buried deep within a forward operating base, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. This was the world of shadows and whispers, a place where missions were planned on encrypted laptops and spoken of in codes. This was the domain of Spectre Unit. 12 men sat around a steel table, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of a holographic map. They were lean, hard men. Their gear meticulously prepared, their silence a testament to their professionalism. At their head was First Lieutenant Michael Miller. He was younger than some of the men he led, but he possessed a preternatural calm that commanded respect. It was a calm, however, that was currently being tested. The target is a high-value individual codenamed the Chemist. The operations officer, a Major Miller had never seen before, stated flatly from a secure video link. The officer's face was a dispassionate collection of pixels. He is located in this compound. A red circle materialized on the map, highlighting a cluster of buildings in a desolate valley. Intel suggests minimal resistance. Local militia poorly equipped. Your orders are to infiltrate, capture the target, and extract before sunrise. This is an off-the-books operation, Lieutenant. You will have no direct support. Questions? Miller leaned forward, his eyes narrowed on the projected layout. Something was bothering him. It was a small thing, a detail that seemed trivial. The thermal imagery showed consistent heat signatures from all the buildings, except one, the supposed barracks. It was cold. Too cold for a building meant to house guards in the chill of the desert night. Major permission to voice a concern, Miller said, his tone respectful but firm. The pixelated face showed a flicker of impatience. Go ahead, Lieutenant. The disposition of enemy forces, sir. The intel suggests they are concentrated on the perimeter. But the barracks shows no heat signature. If they are not there, where are they sleeping? And this valley? It is a natural kill box. The entry and exit points are too clean, too obvious. It feels less like a hideout and more like an invitation. A heavy silence filled the room. The other members of Spectre shifted slightly, their gazes fixed on Miller. They trusted his instincts. The major on the screen was unmoved. Your concern is noted, Lieutenant. However, our intelligence is solid-sourced from the highest levels. The target is confirmed to be present, and time is a critical factor. The window for this operation is closing. Are your men ready or not? The question was not a question. It was an order wrapped in the veneer of choice. To push back further would be to question the entire chain of command on an operation that officially did not exist. Miller felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle upon his shoulders. His gut screamed that this was wrong, that they were walking into a trap. But his duty was to execute the mission he was given. He looked at the faces of his men. They were watching him, their expressions unreadable but their trust absolute. He had to make the call. "Spectre is ready," Miller said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We move out in 20. The video link clicked off, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the glowing red circle on the map. The invitation. As the men began their final gear checks, the quiet sounds of clicking buckles and sliding bolts filling the space, Miller could not shake the feeling of dread. He was leading his men into that valley based on an order that overruled his own intuition. And in his line of work, ignoring your intuition was often the last mistake you ever made. The twin TF-34 engines of the Warthog spooled up with a deep, resonant howl that was more beast than machine. Inside the cockpit, Katarina Rostova felt the familiar vibrations thrum through the flight stick and into her bones. She completed the final checks, her voice a calm monotone, as she recited the litany of procedures to the control tower. Cleared for takeoff. With a final push of the throttles, the A-10 surged forward. It was not a graceful machine on the ground. It was heavy, awkward, its power seeming almost brutish. But as the airspeed indicator climbed and the runway fell away, the Warthog transformed. It lifted into the air with an authority that belied its appearance, becoming a creature of its element. For Katarina, this transition was a kind of alchemy, the moment where the weight of the world was replaced by the freedom of the sky. She banked the aircraft gently, the vast, sun-bleached expanse of the desert unfolding below her like a crumpled map. This was where she felt most herself, encased in titanium, suspended between earth and sun. She did not fly the Warthog. She wore it. Every subtle shift in atmospheric pressure, every change in the engine's pitch, was a sensation she registered as if it were her own body. Her patrol route was a long, lazy loop over a designated sector, a task meant more to establish presence than to achieve any specific objective. An hour into the flight, her practiced eyes scanned the horizon. To the west, a plume of ochre dust was rising, the telltale sign of an approaching sandstorm. It was minor, nothing her aircraft could not handle, but protocol was clear. Deviations from standard procedure were to be avoided unless necessary. Al-Dafra control. "This is Valkyrie 1, she radioed. "Observing developing weather patterns to the west. Adjusting my flight path to vector 090 to maintain safe distance. Will resume original patrol route once clear." "Roger, Valkyrie 1. Control copies." She nudged the control stick, and the A-10 responded instantly, banking eastward onto its new course. It was a routine adjustment, a decision made 1,000 times by 1,000 pilots. Yet this one would change everything. The new vector took her over a desolate stretch of canyons and rocky outcrops, a part of the desert that was usually outside her designated area of operations. Switching her communications panel to scan auxiliary frequencies, an old habit, a way to listen to the silent hum of the battlefield, she heard mostly static. Then, for less than a second, a crackle of clear audio broke through on a non-standard encrypted channel. It was not a voice, but a burst of digital data, frantic and compressed. It was gone as quickly as it came, swallowed again by the static. Katarina's blood ran cold. The signal was wrong. It was not a standard military handshake nor a recognized distress protocol. It was raw, desperate, and felt unofficial. Her training screamed at her to ignore it. It was outside her mission, outside her authority. It was likely just atmospheric interference, but her instincts, scarred and sharpened by failure, told her otherwise. The feeling was sickeningly familiar. It was the same kind of anomaly she had heard moments before the ambush all those years ago. A ghost on the wire. Her fingers moved with a life of their own, marking the general coordinates from which the signal burst had emanated. The location appeared as a small cross on her digital map, blinking silently far from where she was supposed to be. It was a phantom, a whisper. But in the vast, empty silence of the desert sky, a whisper could be louder than a scream. The silence of the valley was absolute. Lieutenant Miller and his 11 men moved like ghosts through the pre-dawn gloom, their night vision goggles casting the world in an eerie monochrome green. They advanced in a staggered formation, weapons at the ready, each footstep placed with practiced care on the loose shale and sand. The target compound lay ahead, a collection of dark, silent shapes against the slightly less dark mountains. Every instinct in Miller's body was screaming. It was too quiet. There were no sentries, no dogs, not even the whisper of a generator. The cold barracks he had noted in the briefing photos loomed like a tombstone. He signaled for his team to halt his hand, a stark shape in the darkness. He scanned the ridges overlooking their position, sweeping his rifle scope across the silent rock formations. He saw nothing. And that was what scared him. He was about to give the order to fall back to abort the mission, based on the sheer wrongness of the situation, when the world exploded. The first shot was not a gunshot, but the blinding white flash and deafening crack of a high-caliber sniper rifle from the ridge to their left. One of his men grunted and fell. Immediately from the ridge in front of them, heavy machine guns opened up their streams of tracer fire, cutting phosphorescent green lines through the darkness. It was a classic L-shaped ambush. They were caught in a crossfire, pinned down in the open ground of the valley floor. Contact left, contact front. Miller roared his voice, barely audible over the cacophony. To the buildings, move. Rockets screamed past them, impacting the ground where they had been moments before, showering them with dirt and rock. The air filled with the whip crack of supersonic bullets and the acrid smell of cordite. There was no thought, only instinct and training. The men of Spectre returned fire, short, controlled bursts, aimed at the muzzle flashes high above, while falling back toward the only cover available. The dark, silent buildings of the compound. They scrambled into the nearest structure, its crumbling mud brick walls offering scant protection. Sparks, the team's young communications specialist, immediately dropped to one knee, deploying his encrypted radio. His fingers flew across the keypad, coding a compressed emergency data burst. It was their only chance, a digital flare sent into the ether, praying for a friendly asset to be listening. "Signal is away," Sparks yelled, just as a rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the wall above him. The structure groaned, and a shower of brick and superheated shrapnel rained down. Sparks cried out a sharp, choked sound and slumped over his radio set. "Sparks is hit!" the team medic shouted, crawling toward him. Miller peeked over a shattered window frame. Muzzle flashes blinked from every ridge, every rock formation. The enemy was not a small, poorly equipped militia. This was a disciplined, well-armed force. They had been drawn into this valley intentionally, lured by flawless intelligence that had to have been a deliberate plant. They were completely and utterly surrounded. The distress signal was out, but as Miller looked at Sparks's pale face, he knew their lifeline was bleeding out on the dusty floor of a trap. The blinking cross on Katarina's navigational display was a persistent, silent accusation. It represented a choice. The disciplined officer in her knew the correct course of action: report the anomaly, await instructions, and follow them without question. The veteran pilot, the survivor, knew that sometimes instructions were wrong. For now, she would follow procedure. It was the only way to legitimize the gnawing feeling in her gut. "Al-Dafra, control, Valkyrie 1. She transmitted, her voice steady, requesting a patch-through to the acting flight commander. There was a brief pause, a crackle of static. "Stand by, Valkyrie." A moment later, a new voice filled her headset, sharp and impatient. "Davies here. What is it, Captain? Your patrol should be uneventful." Lieutenant Colonel Davies was a man who managed his career as meticulously as a flight plan, and he disliked any deviation from the schedule. Katarina knew she had to be concise and factual. Sir, at 0543 Zulu, I intercepted a non-standard encrypted data burst on an auxiliary frequency. Duration was less than 1 second. The signal originated from grid coordinate 479.321. It is outside my designated patrol sector, but I felt it was worth noting. The silence that followed was heavy with disapproval. When Davies finally spoke, his tone was laced with condescension. A data burst, Captain, most likely atmospheric skip or bleed over from a commercial satellite. It is a ghost on the frequency, nothing more. With respect, Sir Katarina pushed. Choosing her words carefully, the compression and format felt military, just not one of our protocols. It felt urgent. Feelings are not factored into my reports. Captain Rostova Davies snapped back, his patience clearly gone. Your mission is to fly a designated route and observe. It is not to investigate every stray signal you happen to come across. You are already off your assigned vector due to the weather. Do not compound that with unauthorized excursions. The words hit Katarina with the force of a physical blow. The tone, the dismissal, the utter lack of curiosity, it was an echo from a ghost of her own. She could almost hear a different commander's voice from a different cockpit on a different day saying, "Negative, Valkyrie. Your primary objective is secure. Disengage and return to base." That day she had obeyed, and men had died. Let me make this perfectly clear. Davies continued, his voice cold and final. Your concern is noted and will be ignored. Return to your designated patrol area. Do not deviate again, and do not go chasing ghosts. Do you copy, Valkyrie 1? A cold fury settled in Katarina's chest. It was happening again. The system, in its rigid adherence to the plan, was willfully blinding itself. She took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the emotion from her voice. I copy, sir, she said, the words clipped and devoid of inflection. Valkyrie 1 out. She disconnected the channel. The cockpit was silent once more, save for the steady hum of the engines. But now the silence felt different. It was the silence of being utterly alone. The official channels were closed. The blinking cross on her screen was no longer just a coordinate. It was her secret, her burden, and her decision to make. The desert sun had begun its ascent, and its first rays sliced through the dust-choked air, illuminating the grim reality of Spectre unit's position. They were trapped. The initial furious exchange of fire had subsided into a patient, methodical siege. The enemy was smart content to tighten the noose slowly, using mortars to chip away at their crumbling mud-brick sanctuary. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust, blood, and fear. Doc. The team medic was doing what he could for sparks, but the comms specialist was unconscious, his breathing shallow. They had propped him against a wall, his damaged radio lying uselessly beside him. Without him, their encrypted lifeline to the outside world was severed. Miller crawled from position to position, his movements low and economical. He checked on each of his men, his voice a low whisper of encouragement. Ammo check, he murmured to a corporal manning a shattered window. The man did not look away from his sector of fire. 1 mag left, sir, and my sidearm. It was the same story everywhere. They had expended most of their ammunition in the initial firefight. Now they were conserving every round, firing only when a target presented itself clearly. They were professional soldiers and they would sell their lives dearly, but Miller knew the grim arithmetic of their situation. They had at best minutes, not hours. Hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. It was being replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The men of Spectre met each other's eyes in the gloom, and in them Miller saw not panic, but a shared, grim acceptance. They would fight to the last man, to the last round. But it was his job as their leader to find a chance where none existed. There was one option left. It was reckless, a violation of every protocol he had ever learned. Broadcasting in the clear would confirm their presence to the enemy and would be an unforgivable breach of operational security. In a normal situation, it would mean the end of his career. In this situation, his career was the least of his concerns. He crawled over to the medic. "How is he?" Doc shook his head, his face streaked with grime. "He is fading, Lieutenant. I cannot stop the bleeding here." That settled it. Miller scrambled back to the team's secondary radio, a smaller, less powerful unit designed for short-range communication. It was not encrypted. He took a deep breath, the dust burning his lungs. He was about to light a fire in the darkness, a signal that could either summon angels or draw every devil in the desert straight to their location. He keyed the microphone, switching it to a common aviation emergency frequency. His voice when he spoke was raspy and strained the sound of a man on the edge of the abyss. "But a Mayday! Mayday, Mayday!" He began the universal signal of absolute distress. "Any Allied unit in the vicinity of grid 479.321, this is Spectre Actual. We are a U.S. Special Operations Unit. We are engaged with a superior enemy force and we are being overrun. We have sustained critical casualties. I repeat, we are being overrun. Any friendly asset, please respond." He released the transmit button. The only reply was the crackle of static and the distant rhythmic thump of an enemy mortar. Katarina flew on the A-10, a gray speck against an immense blue canvas. She was holding to her altered flight path as ordered a model of obedience. But her mind was miles away, fixed on the blinking cross on her map. Davies's words, "Do not go chasing ghosts," echoed in her headset, a taunt from the voice of reason. Reason, she thought bitterly, was what had gotten men killed before. Her hand hovered over the communications panel, an unconscious habit. She kept the emergency frequency open. It was a long shot, a fool's hope. Then it happened. A voice so faint it was almost lost in the hiss of the ether cut through the static. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" Katarina's blood turned to ice. She strained to listen, her entire being focused on the fragile thread of sound. "Shakti in the vicinity of grid 479.321. Spectre Actual. U.S. Special Operations Unit. Engaged. Being overrun." The coordinates. They were a perfect match. The ghost was real. It had a call sign, and it was dying. In that instant, every shred of indecision, every ounce of professional caution evaporated. The years of quiet guilt, the phantom faces of the soldiers she had been forced to abandon, the condescending voice of Davies, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable imperative. There was no choice to be made. There was only an action to be taken. Her vow made in silence so long ago demanded payment. Never again. Her hands moved with fluid certainty. She banked the Warthog so hard that the G-force pushed her deep into her seat. The nose of the aircraft dropped, and the engines roared as she pushed the throttles forward. A calm, automated female voice filled the cockpit. "Warning. Deviating from flight plan." "Acknowledged," Katarina said to the empty air. She descended rapidly, taking the A-10 down into the folds of the terrain. Flying low was dangerous. It put her at risk from ground fire and demanded constant, exhausting concentration. But it also masked her from long-range enemy radar, and for a time from the prying eyes of her own command. The desert floor became a blur of rock and sand just a few hundred feet below. She knew she did not have long before Davies noticed her dramatic change in vector. She needed a cover story, no matter how thin. Keying the radio back to the command frequency, she injected a note of carefully controlled urgency into her voice. Al-Dafra, Control Valkyrie 1. I am declaring a minor in-flight issue. My primary INS is showing discrepancies. I am experiencing a navigational malfunction. Breaking from my patrol route to get a visual confirmation of my position using terrain features. Will advise. It was a flimsy excuse. A modern INS did not just fail without other more catastrophic warnings, but it was plausible enough to buy her minutes, and minutes were all she had. Roger, Valkyrie. Stand by, the controller replied, a note of confusion in his voice. She did not wait for Davies to come on the line and challenge her. She was already gone, a gray thunderbolt streaking low across the desert, chasing a voice in the static. She had just thrown her career away on a desperate plea from a man she had never met, and she had never felt more certain of anything in her life. The terrain began to rise into the jagged canyons she had seen on the map. Katarina pulled back on the stick, lifting the A-10 out of its low-level flight path. To get a clear picture of the battlefield, she needed altitude, but altitude made her a target. She climbed in a wide, sweeping spiral, keeping her distance, a hawk circling a killing field. Her thumb moved to the control stick, activating the sniper advanced targeting pod slaved to her helmet-mounted display. Her right eye squinted as the view from the pod filled one of the multifunction displays in the cockpit. The monochrome world of thermal imaging replaced the desert's muted colors. The landscape was no longer just rock and sand. It was a tapestry of heat and cold. She slewed the sensor toward the grid coordinates from the Mayday call. There. A small, crumbling compound. Inside, clustered together for survival, were a group of heat signatures. She zoomed in, the image sharpening. She counted them. 1, 2, 3. 11 distinct bright white shapes, human bodies under immense stress. A 12th signature was dimmer, its heat fading. The casualty. It had to be them. Spectre unit was real. A wave of cold validation washed over her. She was not chasing ghosts. She was looking at men about to die. Then she widened the sensor's field of view, panning across the ridges that formed the valley's rim. Her breath caught in her throat. The ridges were alive with heat. Dozens of signatures spread out in professionally dug-in fighting positions. She saw the hot barrels of heavy machine guns, the distinct thermal bloom of multiple mortar pits. This was not a poorly equipped militia. This was a disciplined, entrenched force. Her sensor swept further along the main ridge, and then she saw it. A boxy shape with 4 long barrels and a telltale radar dish on top. The thermal signature was unmistakable. A ZSU-23-4 Shilka, a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. The blood drained from her face. A Shilka meant this was not just an ambush. It was a dedicated anti-air trap. They had been expecting air support. They had planned for it. The enemy knew exactly what they were doing. The snippets of information coalesced into a terrifying picture. The flawless intelligence, the perfect kill box, the heavy weapons, the anti-aircraft platform Spectre had not stumbled into a firefight. They had been deliberately sacrificed, led to an execution site. The initial adrenaline of her defiant flight was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. Lieutenant Miller and his men had absolutely no chance of survival. They would be systematically wiped out in the next few minutes. Her lie to Davies about a navigational error seemed like a child's fantasy now. The situation had escalated far beyond a matter of career-ending insubordination. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she forced it down. There was no room for it. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. The 12 men below her could not afford it. She looked at the screen no longer as a pilot, but as a predator. She analyzed the placement of the mortars, the firing arcs of the heavy machine guns, the blind spot of the Shilka. Her mind began to work, calculating angles of attack, prioritizing threats. She was their only hope. The thought was not heroic. It was terrifyingly, crushingly heavy. The time for lies and half-truths was over. Katarina's feigned navigational error was a distant memory burned away by the hard reality on her screen. This was a troops-in-contact emergency, the most urgent call a pilot could make. She switched her radio back to the primary command frequency, her voice devoid of any previous artifice. It was now sharp, cold, and precise. Al-Dhafra command. This is Valkyrie 1. I am declaring a troops-in-contact emergency at grid 479.321. I have positively identified a U.S. Special Operations Unit pinned down by a heavily armed battalion-sized enemy force. They have sustained casualties and are in imminent danger of being overrun. Anti-aircraft assets are present. I require immediate clearance to engage. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then Davies's voice erupted in her ear, apoplectic with rage. Valkyrie 1, what in the hell do you think you are doing? There are no U.S. forces in that sector. You are directly disobeying a lawful order. I am ordering you to... He was cut off mid-sentence. A new voice took over the channel, and the change was palpable. Where Davies was hot and angry, this voice was Arctic cold, radiating an authority that silenced all others. Valkyrie 1, this is General Peterson's CENTCOM forward command. I am taking control of this channel. Katarina's hands tightened on the controls. A 2-star general. The situation had escalated beyond the confines of the airbase. General, she responded immediately. I have visual confirmation of the unit. Call sign Spectre. They are... Captain Rostova, the general, interrupted, his voice calm and utterly devoid of emotion. I have the latest intelligence reports on my screen. I also have your flight path. According to all official records, there are no friendly assets operating at the coordinates you have cited. Katarina felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She knew what was happening. She had read about it in after-action reports and heard it whispered in classified briefings. It was the cold, brutal calculus of clandestine warfare. Sir, with all due respect, my sensors are showing 12 U.S. soldiers. They are alive. They are fighting. The official records are wrong. The general's response was the final devastating blow. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact, a rewriting of reality itself. No, Captain. The records are correct. There are no friendly forces in that area. Repeat, there are no friendly forces in that area. Your mission is complete. You will disengage immediately and return to Al-Dhafra. Do not transmit further on this matter. That is a direct order. Acknowledge. The words hung in the air, each one a nail in the coffin of the men below. Deniable asset. Spectre had failed their secret mission, and now to prevent political fallout they were being erased. Their lives were being sacrificed for strategic silence. It was not a tragic miscalculation. It was a deliberate choice made by the very men who had sent them there. A pure, incandescent rage burned through Katarina, so intense it felt like ice. The system she had sworn to uphold was not just broken. It was actively malevolent. It was a machine that consumed its own. She looked from the serene blue sky outside her cockpit to the frantic, desperate firefight unfolding on her screen. The general was waiting for her acknowledgement, for her compliance. The general's order hung in the silent cockpit, a demand for submission. The radio carrier wave hummed an expectant electronic breath, waiting for her to fall in line. Katarina looked at the thermal image of the 12 desperate men below, then at the vast, indifferent sky around her. She did not say a word. She simply reached forward with a steady hand and switched the command frequency off. Silence. The sudden absence of command's voice was a physical relief, like a pressure valve being released. She was alone now, truly alone. Just her aircraft, and her conscience. She eased the Warthog into a gentle circling bank, establishing a wide orbit high above the valley. A holding pattern. The aircraft, a predator suspended in limbo, became a perfect metaphor for her own soul. Below, a battle for survival raged. Within her, a battle for her spirit was reaching its climax. Her training, her career, her entire life had been predicated on a simple principle: follow the chain of command. It was the bedrock of military order. To defy a direct order from a general was not just insubordination. It was a fundamental betrayal of the uniform she wore. She saw her future with stark clarity: a court-martial, the stripping of her wings, a life of disgrace. Everything she had worked for would be turned to ash. And for what? For 12 men she did not know, on a mission that was never supposed to exist. Logic dictated the answer. Self-preservation was the most basic instinct. Acknowledging the general's order was the only rational path. But then the ghost in her cockpit, the one she had suppressed for so long, rose up. The memory was no longer a fleeting shadow, but a vivid, agonizing vision. She was back in the skies over Zabul province. She could see the face of Army Captain Eva Rosales looking up at her from the ground, her features clear through the targeting pod's magnification. Rosales' unit was pinned down just like Spectre, and the order had been the same: disengage, return to base. Katarina had obeyed. She had banked her plane and flown away, watching the thermal signatures of Rosales and her soldiers extinguish one by one on her screen. She would never forget the final image. She saw the look in Captain Rosales' eyes. It was not anger. It was a hollow, soul-shattering look of betrayal. That look had haunted her every day since. It was there in her dreams, in the reflection of the cockpit glass. It was the price of her obedience. Circling high above this new valley, Katarina understood. There were two kinds of honor. There was the honor of following rules, and there was the honor of doing what was right. She had chosen the former once, and it had broken her. To do so again would not just end her career. It would extinguish what was left of her soul. Living as a pilot who had been court-martialed was one thing. Living as a woman who had twice abandoned her comrades to die was another. The second was a fate worse than any punishment a military court could devise. The internal battle was over. A strange, profound calm settled over her. The holding pattern was finished. She leveled the Warthog's wings, the nose of the aircraft, pointing back toward the valley of death. Her hand moved to the communications panel, selecting not the command frequency, but the open emergency channel she had heard Miller's plea on. Her decision was made. She had chosen her fate. On the ground, Lieutenant Miller was preparing to die. Another mortar round had landed just outside their building, shaking the very foundations and sending a fresh shower of dust and debris down upon them. He could hear the enemy fighters moving closer, their shouts growing louder. He chambered a round in his rifle, took a deep breath, and gave a grim, accepting nod to the man next to him. This was the end. And then a voice spoke from the radio at his hip, a voice that did not belong to the cacophony of battle. It was calm, clear, and female. "Spectre Actual, this is Valkyrie 1. How do you copy?" Miller froze. He stared at the radio as if it were a venomous snake. The call sign was unknown. No support had been promised. For a terrifying second, he thought it was an enemy trick, some form of psychological warfare before the final assault. He cautiously keyed the microphone. "Unknown station, identify yourself." "I am an Air Force asset, call sign Valkyrie 1. the voice replied, with no hint of agitation. "I have an A-10C overhead fully loaded. I am here to help. I need targeting information, Spectre. Talk to me. Where does it hurt the most?" The words cut through Miller's despair like a laser. An A-10C, a Warthog. The sound of the name alone was a prayer for every soldier who had ever been pinned down. The sheer, unflappable professionalism in her voice was impossible to fake. This was not a trick. This was a miracle. Hope and emotion he had brutally suppressed moments earlier surged through him with a painful, breathtaking force. He had no idea who this pilot was or where she came from, but she was his only chance. He was not going to waste it. He grabbed his map, what was left of it, and crawled to the window. Valkyrie 1 copy, that he said, his voice now sharp and focused, the soldier taking over from the dying man. "We have multiple heavy machine gun emplacements on the ridge to our north. They have us completely suppressed. Give me coordinates, Spectre." Miller rattled them off, reading the numbers from his map and confirming them with his compass. Grid 479er decimal 890. Another at decimal 911. They are dug in deep. "Solid copy," the voice of Valkyrie 1 replied. There was no hesitation. "What about the mortars? Southeast of our position near the base of the canyon. They are walking their rounds in on us. We cannot see them from here." "I see them," she said simply. The confidence in those 3 words sent a shiver down Miller's spine. For the first time, he felt like he was not fighting alone. He was no longer just a man on the ground. He was the eyes for a god in the machine above. A bond forged in desperation and transmitted over radio waves connected them. They were a team. "Roger that, Valkyrie. We are ready for your run." A brief pause, and then the voice came back imbued with a cold, deadly promise. "Solid copy, Spectre. All targets acquired. Valkyrie is inbound. I advise you keep your heads down." With the target coordinates locked in her fire control system, Katarina rolled the A-10 onto its side and pushed the stick forward, committing to the attack. The sky vanished, replaced by a dizzying view of the brown, scarred earth rushing up to meet her. The engines screamed as she descended, a hawk diving upon its prey. Her world narrowed to the glowing symbology of the heads-up display and the patch of ground designated for destruction. As she dropped below the rim of the valley, the battlefield erupted. The enemy, realizing a far greater threat was now upon them, turned their weapons skyward. The air around her cockpit filled with streams of green and red tracer fire, lazy, beautiful lines of light that were in reality thousands of rounds of hot metal seeking her destruction. Alarms began to chime in her headset, a symphony of threats. She ignored them all. Her thumb moved to the red button on her control stick. The targeting reticle was perfectly aligned with the first machine gun nest Miller had identified. She was less than a mile out, the distance closing with terrifying speed. She squeezed the trigger. The entire aircraft shuddered, as if struck by a giant's hammer. A sound that was not a sound, but a physical concussion ripped through the air, the legendary brrrr-t of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. For 2 seconds, the cannon unleashed a torrent of 30mm armor-piercing incendiary rounds, a chainsaw from the heavens, tearing through the fabric of the earth. Through her display, Katarina saw the enemy emplacement simply cease to exist. The rock, the sand, the gun, the men, it all vanished in a roiling cloud of fire smoke and pulverized earth. She pulled back on the stick, the G-forces pressing her into her seat as she began her climb. And that was when her threat receiver shrieked a piercing, high-pitched tone that signified the one thing every A-10 pilot dreaded. Missile launch. Infrared lock. Her eyes snapped to the left. A plume of white smoke was streaking toward her from the valley floor. A man-pads. a shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missile. There was no time to think, only to act. Her training took over her body. She broke hard, right pushing the Warthog into a turn so violent it felt as if the wings would be torn from the fuselage. Simultaneously, her other hand jabbed at the countermeasures button, sending a cascade of brilliant white flares tumbling from the aircraft, each one a burning decoy hotter than her engines. The missile, seduced by the easier target, detonated harmlessly in the empty air behind her, leveling out her breath ragged and her body screaming from the strain of the maneuver. Katarina felt a strange calm wash over her. The fear was gone, burned away in the crucible of the first pass. Now there was only the cold, clear logic of the fight. She and the Warthog were one entity, a single instrument of focused, purposeful destruction. She had survived their first real punch. She had hit them back harder, and she was already lining up her next run. 2 more passes. 2 more plumes of fire and smoke erupted from the valley ridges as Katarina systematically dismantled the enemy's key positions. The mortars were silent. The most threatening machine gun nests were craters. Chaos reigned among the enemy, but they were not broken. They were regrouping. "Valkyrie, we are making a break for the West Ridge!" Miller's voice crackled in her ear, strained and desperate. "It is our only way out. Cover us." "Solid copy, Spectre. I am watching you go," she replied, her voice a mask of calm she did not feel. She watched on her thermal display as the tiny white figures of Spectre unit scrambled from their ruined shelter, moving in a desperate dash for freedom. But at the same time, she saw a larger group of enemy fighters coalescing, moving to intercept them. They were faster, they had a better angle. Spectre was not going to make it. Bombs were too slow. Missiles were too imprecise. The risk of friendly fire of fratricide was too high. There was only one option left. It was reckless, unorthodox, and probably suicidal. It was in that moment that the ghost of the general's voice returned, a cold whisper in her memory. "There are no friendly forces in that area. That is a direct order. The final barrier, the final command to obey." Katarina looked at the men running for their lives below. She looked at the enemy closing in. She thought of Captain Eva Rosales' eyes. The choice was not a choice at all. Spectre actual. She said, her voice now impossibly serene, broadcasting on the open channel for the world and its ghosts to hear. "I see them cutting you off. Fall back 50 meters. Valkyrie, we cannot. We will be trapped," Miller yelled back. "Trust me," she commanded. "Get back, now." She pushed the stick forward, diving not at the enemy, but at the empty space between the hunter and the hunted. The ground screamed up at her, every rock and bush rendered in terrifying detail. The Shilka on the ridge opened up its 4 barrels, spitting a furious stream of 23mm cannon shells that stitched a pattern across the sky around her. She ignored it. Her A-10 was now flying so low that its shadow was a monstrous, fleeting specter upon the battlefield. She could see the individual faces of the enemy fighters, their expressions a mixture of shock and terror. She pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 did not just fire. It detonated, spewing a continuous wall of fire and exploding shells directly in the path of the advancing enemy. It was not a targeted strike. It was a line drawn in the sand with thunder and lightning, a flaming barrier of "thou shalt not pass." In that moment, flying through a storm of her own making, Katarina felt a profound sense of peace. There was no past, no future, no court-martial, no disgrace. There was only the roar of her cannon, the smell of cordite, and the singular, perfect clarity of her purpose. This was her atonement. This was the moment she finally set her own ghost free. Through the maelstrom she had created, Spectre escaped, scrambling up the western ridge to safety. Her job was done. As she pulled the Warthog up its engines, screaming in protest, a series of violent hammering impacts slammed into her right wing and fuselage. The Shilka had finally found its mark. Red lights flashed across her console, and a piercing alarm blared through the cockpit, a sound that signaled the beginning of her own desperate fight for survival. The world became a cacophony of screaming alarms and shuddering metal. The A-10 yawed violently to the right as cannon shells tore through the wing, shredding hydraulics and crippling the engine. Red and amber warning lights flashed across Katarina's console like a hellish Christmas tree. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burning electrical wires. Her body reacted before her mind could process the fear. With practiced, forceful movements, she fought the crippled aircraft, jamming the left rudder pedal to the floor to counteract the drag from the dead right engine. Her hands flew across the control panel, flipping switches, shutting down fuel flow to the fire, and rerouting power to auxiliary systems. The fire extinguisher lights blinked, and the flames engulfing the engine sputtered out, leaving a trail of black smoke against the blue sky. The Warthog was a tough aircraft, but it was mortally wounded. It flew with the grace of a falling brick. Every instinct screamed at her to key the mic and declare a Mayday to call for rescue. But she could not. A Mayday call would bring the entire command structure down upon her right here, right now. It would mean questions she could not answer, and an audience to the final act of her defiance. No. She would face the consequences, but she would do it on her own terms. She would bring her aircraft home. The long flight back to Al Dhafra was an agonizing battle of attrition. With one engine and failing hydraulics, keeping the plane level required constant, exhausting physical effort. The adrenaline of the battle faded, replaced by a profound, hollow emptiness. There was no elation, no sense of victory. She had saved 12 men. She had also thrown away her life's work. A quiet, cold acceptance settled over her. She had made her choice, and now she would fly to meet its consequences. An hour later, the familiar hazy outline of Al Dhafra appeared on the horizon. The aircraft was still losing hydraulic pressure. The landing gear might not deploy. A crash landing was a very real possibility. It was time to break radio silence. The control tower would be expecting a frantic, panicked call. They would be ready to scramble the crash crews and declare a full-scale emergency. Katarina took a slow, steadying breath. That was not how this would end. She keyed the microphone, and when she spoke, her voice was unnervingly, unnaturally calm. Al Dhafra Tower, this is Valkyrie 1. Valkyrie 1, we were about to list you as overdue. The controller replied, relief evident in his voice. Report your status. Tower Valkyrie 1 is on approach for landing, she said, choosing each word with surgical precision. Experiencing a minor control issue. Requesting a priority landing on the main runway. No emergency services required at this time. There was a pause on the other end. A pilot with a minor control issue did not sound so utterly calm, but an order was an order, and a request was a request. Roger, Valkyrie. You are cleared for priority landing on runway 30. The runway is yours. Valkyrie copies, she said, and then fell silent. She lined up the crippled Warthog with the distant runway lights. They looked less like a promise of safety and more like the gates of her own judgment. She had brought the ship home. Now it was time to face the storm. The landing had been a controlled crash, a testament to both the Warthog's durability and Katarina's skill. She had walked away without a scratch. The moment she stepped onto the tarmac, however, she was met by armed military police and escorted to her quarters, her wings effectively clipped. Days later, she sat in a sterile, windowless conference room. Across the table sat Lieutenant Colonel Davies, a smug, vindicated look on his face, and two grim-faced colonels she did not recognize. On a large screen, the impassive, pixelated face of General Peterson presided over the proceedings. This was not a trial. It was an administrative execution. They did not ask about Spectre. They did not ask about the Mayday call. Their questions were a carefully constructed narrative about a pilot who inexplicably deviated from her flight plan, lied to her commanding officer about a navigational malfunction, and recklessly engaged unknown targets outside the established rules of engagement, wasting military resources and damaging a valuable aircraft. They were building a case not for treason, but for instability. It was a cleaner, quieter way to end a career. When they had finished, General Peterson's voice filled the room. "Captain Rostova, do you have anything to say in your defense before we conclude this hearing?" This was her moment to plead, to argue, to try and salvage some fragment of her career. The colonels leaned forward slightly. Davies smirked. They expected a fight or tears. She gave them neither. Katarina sat perfectly still, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. She looked directly at the camera transmitting her image to the general. "Sirs," she began, her voice calm and even. "I received a credible distress call. I used my aircraft's sensors to visually confirm that American lives were in imminent danger of being extinguished. I made a command decision based on the battlefield information I had at that time in order to protect those lives." She stopped speaking. That was it. That was her entire defense. She did not mention Spectre. She did not mention the orders to stand down. She presented them with a simple, unimpeachable truth and left them to choke on it. The silence in the room was heavy, uncomfortable. Her quiet dignity was a weapon they had not anticipated. The verdict, of course, had been decided before the hearing ever began. To avoid a messy court-martial that might unearth truths they wanted buried, she would be offered an honorable discharge under the condition of signing a permanent binding non-disclosure agreement. Her flight logs would be classified at the highest level. The battle in the valley and the existence of Spectre would be officially erased. Captain Katarina Valkyrie Rostova as a pilot would cease to exist. On her last day on the base, she packed her few personal belongings into a single duffel bag. There was no sadness, no anger. In the quiet of her room, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had traded her wings for a clear conscience. It was a price she was willing to pay. As she prepared to walk out the door for the last time, she saw it. A small, plain cardboard box sitting on the floor just outside her doorway. There was no name, no return address. Puzzled, she picked it up and opened it. Inside, nestled on a piece of rough-spun cloth, lay a piece of metal. It was the base of a 30mm shell casing from a GAU-8, its jagged edges filed down until they were perfectly smooth. On its heavy brassy surface, a single word had been crudely but carefully etched by hand. Valkyrie. She closed her fingers around it. The metal was heavy, solid, and real. It was not a medal to be pinned on a uniform or a citation to be read in a ceremony. It was a secret, a silent testament passed from one warrior to another. It was all the recognition she would ever need. 1 year later, the cold air of the northern mountains was crisp and carried the scent of pine. At a small private airfield nestled amidst sprawling forests stood an old corrugated iron hangar. Inside, Katarina Rostova, dressed in a worn leather jacket and faded blue jeans, was tightening a bolt on the engine of an old Cessna propeller plane. Her hands were now covered in a thin layer of grease, no longer the clean-gloved hands of a fighter pilot. On a wooden workbench amidst tools and technical schematics sat a heavy brass object. A piece of a 30mm shell casing its edges filed smooth, engraved with a single word, Valkyrie. It was not displayed like a trophy. It simply sat there, a silent testament in the middle of an ordinary life. The only real medal she would ever need. No one ever spoke of that day again. The mission logs were permanently sealed in some archive in Langley or the Pentagon. Spectre unit officially had never existed. 12 soldiers had returned from the dead, but their story was buried under the weight of national security. It had become a nameless battle in a forgotten war, and she was its anonymous hero. Suddenly, a familiar sound echoed from the distance, breaking the mountain silence. The sky-tearing roar of a pair of F-22 fighter jets on a training run from a nearby Air Force base. That sound, which had once been the symphony of her life, was now just an echo from another world. Katarina paused her work, listening until the roar faded into the distance, returning the peace. She felt no regret, no sadness or bitterness, only a profound sense of peace. Her fingers unconsciously brushed against the shell casing on the bench. Then she looked up, her gaze drifting out through the wide-open hangar doors. The sky was still there, vast, blue, and promising. But for her, it was no longer a battlefield or a heavy responsibility. It had returned to its original nature, a space of quiet freedom. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, and she returned to her work.